Hello everyone, this is Dr. Blinch from 2024, and today we're going to talk about motor programs. I couldn't find a good image for this, so I went with a picture of a motor and of a computer program. Although that doesn't really convey what I mean when I say motor programs, but let's get into it. So if we think about our last module where we talked about the dorsal and ventral visual streams. So think about when you're using your dorsal stream and you're reaching for a target. What you likely do as you reach for a target is you make corrections as you go. So you see your hand, you see the target, and you might realize, oh, my hand needs to be a little bigger, a little smaller. We make these corrections, and that's called online control. You're invoking control during the movement. Now, the more engineering term for this is closed loop control, and that's what I'm trying to depict here. So let's say we're talking about a reaching movement. So you're reaching, maybe you're going to grab an apple. So you see the apple, you select a reaching movement to the apple, you prepare that motor program. Well, we'll learn more about that today. You go through response programming to prepare those motor commands. And then you send those out and you begin to reach. That's not the end of information processing, though. During the reach, you can make adjustments called online control or closed loop control. So as you reach, you take in feedback. Visual feedback is quite dominant, so you can see how your hand is approaching the target. You also have the proprioception, sense of where your hand is, the size of it and where it is in space. So you can use both of those sources of feedback to potentially adjust your movement. So think about visual feedback or proprioceptive feedback coming into your system. From response programming, we have a copy of the goal of the movement. Okay, the body, the mind knows that we want to grasp the apple. And the feedback and the goal meet at what we call the comparator. And the comparator basically says, well, I'm trying to grasp the apple. Does the feedback say I'm correctly on the path to grasp this apple? Maybe it realizes we're too high or too low. So the comparator, and there's a few spots in the mind where we compare the goal and the feedback, but one prominent source is within the cerebellum. So the cerebellum says, okay, are we on track? And it can send an error signal back into information processing. It could be no error. The comparator could say, yep, we're on track, just keep going as we prepared. But let's say it decides, oh, my hand is too high, that we're reaching too high. That goes into information processing, and we might say, okay, well, let's make a correction, let's reach lower, let's program that correction, and then let's send it out to make an online correction via closed loop control. And then, of course, this process can continue several times within a movement. So that's closed loop control, and the terminology is a little strange. I think it's borrowed from engineering. You can think about a circuit, a closed circuit. So this circuit here is closed. The electrons are flowing from the negative to the positive of the battery, and the light turns on because this is a closed circuit. So same thing here. You think about this circuit. It's closed, as in the comparator sends information back through information processing. If you read a textbook about closed loop control, the stereotypical example that they're going to talk about is a thermostat. So this applies, yes, to human movements, but also to machines within our environment. So a thermostat, the temperatures here are a little odd. I should take my own picture with realistic temperatures. But here it says, okay, the inside the house is 66, and it's set to 62, to heat to 62. So the thermostat is going to compare the feedback that, okay, it's 66 to the goal of 62. And right now, it's hotter than it wants it to be. So it's set to heat, so basically it won't turn on the heater because it's hotter than it needs to be. If it was a super fancy system, I guess I could say, okay, well, maybe we want to turn on the air conditioner to get it down to 62. So let's say it does that. So the comparator or the thermostat says, well, there's some air, it's 66, we want it to be 62, we're 4 degrees too hot. So, what should we do? And its information processing would say, well, turn on the air conditioner. So the air conditioner turns on, and maybe now it drops to 64, and it says, okay, well, it's currently 64, our goal is 62, still too hot, so keep running the air conditioner. And then eventually it would be 62 degrees inside, and that's our goal, and it would say, okay, there's no air, that's perfect, so turn off the air conditioner. And you can also imagine if it got too cold, then it would turn on the heat. So that's a thermostat. It's always checking the temperature in the environment to the goal temperature, and it will turn on or turn off something to meet that goal. So closed loop control, we use it a lot, and it's very useful to make sure we have precise movements. But it's not perfect, and the chief limitation here is processing time. It takes time to go through that closed loop control loop. So we have to compare the goal to the current state of the world, whether that's the temperature or say the visual position of my hand, the proprioceptive position of my hand, and that's not instantaneous, it takes time. Because of that, we can't make super fast corrections to our movements. Now the mind and the brain, they are fast, neural traffic is particularly fast, but it's not instantaneous. So there's a limit to how quickly we can make corrections. This might be more obvious in a physical system. So if you think about taking a shower, and if you have a normal system, not a fancy system, but you've got a hot water tank, and it takes some time for that hot water to heat up and to reach the shower. So when I go into my shower, I turn the knob on, and I turn it on to the same spot it was yesterday. But if I feel the water right away, well, it's not going to be that hot. It might even be cold. And that's because there's a long time for the hot water heater to turn on, to get the water hot, and then to just send it physically down the pipes to the shower. So that's a system, your hot water heater, that takes a really long time to respond. So because of that, corrections that I make at the shower, I can't make them quickly. So if I'm in the shower and I want it to be hotter, I might turn it up, but I then have to wait for the system to respond to that. I won't turn it up, be like, oh, it's not hot enough. Oh, turn up, turn up. Now, I'm not going to keep turning it up, because once the system kicks in, then I'll scald myself. So that's a very slow closed loop control system. Now the human body is faster than that. Pumping water, heating water is slow, but there still are limits to how quickly we can make closed loop corrections. And often 100 milliseconds is thought to be kind of the minimum time to use closed loop control. So if we think about a very rapid action, something that's 100 milliseconds or maybe even shorter or a little bit longer, those are too fast for closed loop control. So examples could be a boxer's jab, very professional boxer, very fast boxer would have a very fast jab. And then even swinging a bat in baseball. It's a very fast movement. There's not infinite time for corrections. If you think about a batter, they might realize midway through the swing that it's a curveball and they need to move their bat, but by the time they realize that and make the correction, their bat has swung through and the ball has gone by. So every part of closed loop control takes time. The comparator has to generate an error. That takes some time. We now need to detect the error. It's got to go back through information processing. We have to select a correction, so response selection. We have to program the correction. These first 4 steps are fairly fast because this is all neuronal traffic. So that's much faster than, say, heating up water. But the last step is the slowest. And if you think about the baseball batter, he might get through all those steps and realize, I gotta move my bat a little lower. Well, now we're talking about a physical movement in the real world. And that is a lot slower than neuronal traffic. So even though the batter might realize, hey, my bat's in the wrong spot for the curveball, they might not be able to actually get the bat to move there in time. So what we're going to look at is, is it possible to move without feedback? So there's kind of two situations here. One is we're doing a very fast movement and there's no time for feedback. We'll try this ourselves later. And the other is, well, maybe feedback is not available. So can we move without feedback? Let's say we have no sensory input. Can we still move? And the answer is yes. So that's a bit of a spoiler, much as this is a spoiler on a spoiler. So the more interesting question we're going to address is, well, how do we move without feedback? The answer is open loop control. And open loop control is, closed loop control without the closed loop part. So kind of simpler in a way. So imagine, let's say, we don't even have sensory input. Let's just say I decide that I want to, hold my hand up. So my brain selects that response, I program that response, and I reach my hand up. So I close my eyes. I was closing my eyes there, so I don't have vision. I have no visual information. But that's not a real test of moving without any sensory input, because I still have proprioception. I mean, I have other senses too, my sense of sound, although that's probably not going to help me move my arm very much. But proprioception is definitely an issue. Very easy to close my eyes, but it's not easy. There's a few ways for me to get rid of proprioception from my arm to see whether I can move without closed loop control in an open loop manner. Open loop, this is kind of, again, borrowed from engineering. And here, think of a circuit, that has an opening. It's like physically open. So now the electrons don't flow from negative to positive, and the light doesn't turn on. We can still go through information processing. We can program a movement. We can send it out. But once it's sent out, it's going to play out to the muscles exactly as prepared in advance. We can't make any corrections. So what are some examples of open loop control systems in the real world? So we'll talk about 3. Again, in a textbook, these are kind of the most common examples. One of those are traffic lights. Now this can be a little complicated because you can have traffic lights that respond to the environment, more complex traffic lights. So think about a light where it will sense if there's a car in the left turn lane, and if there is, they'll do the left turn signal, or where there's buttons for pedestrians to press. Now those are closed loop control systems. But we've probably all had the experience either late at night, early in the morning, and you're stuck at a red light and no one's around, right? And the traffic light in this case is a simple open loop control system. It's just going to cycle through green, yellow, red, green, yellow, red, over and over with a preset program. It doesn't matter that you're the only car there. It doesn't know that. It's not listening to feedback from the environment. The world could end, there could be a zombie apocalypse, and the lights would still cycle through, green, yellow, and red as long as they had power. So simple traffic lights are an open loop control system. They're going through their program over and over. They're not probing the environment. Another example are in-ground sprinklers. So typically these have a program where you set, so maybe you say, okay, I want the sprinklers to turn on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 a.m. for 30 minutes. And they're going to do that program. They're going to run through it regardless of what happens. And you've probably had the experience before where it's raining and someone's sprinklers are on, and that's because they're an open loop system. They're not probing the environment and saying, hey, is it raining? Does the grass actually need water? No, they're just going to follow that program, almost to a fault. And a third example is a toaster. I thought I'd find a fun toaster for this image here. So when you set the toaster, I'm not sure where the settings are in here, but let's say you say we want a medium toast, medium level of toasting. You put the toast in, you push the lever down, and it's going to follow that program. So if you set it to medium, it will toast for whatever the medium time is. If the bread starts to burn, it doesn't care. It's just going to keep toasting. It's not listening to the environment. If you forget to put bread in at all and push the toaster down, it's still going to go ahead and toast that bread. So those are examples of physical systems that are open loop in nature. Now, how can we test this in humans? So I already said it's easy. We can close our eyes. Now we have no visual information. But what about getting rid of proprioception? And we're going to look at a special clinical population that lacks proprioception. So we're going to look at a condition known as deafferentation, and we're going to watch part of a video of Ian Waterman, a very famous individual who became deafferented after a virus. And again, this is a very weird case, kind of like Clive Waring, where the virus attacked his dorsal root ganglions. Now, just a couple things about Ian before we watch the video. Normally, he relies on vision. He doesn't have proprioception, so he's even more reliant on vision. But if we ask him to close his eyes and move, we'll see that he can. So even without vision, proprioception, no closed loop control, he can still make movements. His case of deafferentation is very rare. We'll come back and talk about GL, another individual who's deafferented. The more common way to be deafferented, and this is also uncommon, and let me look at my notes here, is if you happen to take mega doses of vitamin B6. So taking mega doses of vitamins, probably not a good idea. And some of those, your body will just excrete and it doesn't matter, but build up of vitamin B6 is actually harmful. Now, the last time this was trendy, it was back in the 1980s, and for some reason there were some individuals taking mega doses of vitamins. And some of those, not a problem, although not recommended. But if you take B6, too much of it for weeks, the condition is called, I might mispronounce this, pyridoxine neurotoxicity. And the same sort of damage that happened to Ian occurs. You damage your dorsal root ganglions. Now, for these people, it wouldn't be as severe as Ian. They would start to lose proprioceptive feedback. So you'd start to lose the feeling of your arms, your legs, your body, and you would likely notice this. You'd see the doctor, and hopefully they realize that you're taking these mega doses of vitamins. They tell you to stop, and you would actually recover. But if for some reason you kept taking mega doses of these vitamins, you could become permanently deafferented, just like Ian Waterman. So check out the first 10 minutes and 45 seconds of this video, and then come back here and we'll talk more about it. All right, so that's the fascinating story of Ian Waterman. And there's a very famous book written about him by Jonathan Cole. And Jonathan worked very closely with Ian when writing this book and understanding his condition and also testing him and trying to help him. So the book actually reads more like an autobiography because Jonathan had such insight into Ian's condition. Now it's called Pride and a Daily Marathon. And Ian says that making natural movements all day long is as hard for him as if you were running a daily marathon. And the reason he doesn't use a wheelchair as most people do with this condition, or I think actually everyone except Ian, was his pride. He didn't want to be in a wheelchair, and even though it takes tremendous amounts of effort, he does that because he's a proud, maybe an overly proud individual. So let's look at what happened to Ian. So hopefully this is something you've seen before in anatomy. So we have the spinal cord here, and we have the output of the spinal cord. Those are the ventral roots. So you can imagine motor commands, traveling down and then heading out to the muscle. Now the input travels a different pathway. It travels via the dorsal root ganglions and then the dorsal root of the spinal nerves, into the spine and then up to the brain. So there's this nice output and input organization within the spinal cord. Now Ian's condition, that virus, for whatever odd reason, attacked his dorsal root ganglion. And there's two pathways in here, and the good news is only one was destroyed. I mean, that's still not good. So the pathway via the dorsal root ganglions that sense touch and proprioception, this was permanently destroyed. Intact, though, was his ability to sense pain and non-painful temperatures. So that's the good news, although touch and proprioception is maybe more helpful than pain and non-painful temperatures. So Ian lost the ability to feel. He lost proprioception from the neck down. And that probably brings up the question of, well, why is it that he could still feel his face? Why was neck up preserved? And here we see dermatones. The third cranial nerve brings in proprioceptive information from the neck, C4 a little lower on the neck, C5, T1 kind of getting lower and lower with the spinal nerves. Now the face and some of the neck is different in that sensory information from it goes to the cranial nerves. So let's see, where's an example? Okay, the trigeminal nerve, this is sensory information from the face, the sinuses, and teeth. I think a root of this is often what they, freeze when you have dental work done. So the good news about the cranial nerves is they don't enter the spinal cord. They're above that, so they don't have dorsal root ganglions, and they weren't impacted at all. So that's great because Ian can still, feel everything kind of from the neck-ish up. All right, now what did Ian say about movements? And I think this is a wonderful quote with amazing insight, even though he's not a motor control researcher at all, but I guess his very practical experience probably trumps that. So he said about movements that I would have to plan it before I did it, that I would have to structure it in my mind. And to me, he's talking about information processing, that he's going to have to select a movement, he's going to have to program it, and then send it out to his muscles in an open loop manner. And he's got no ability, if his eyes are closed, to use closed loop control. So he's got some sort of goal. Okay, I want to sit up in bed. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to take out that motor program, and then I'm going to send it to my muscles. So what is a motor program? I know I've thrown this out a few times, so here's the exact definition. It's a pre-structured set of neural commands, organized in advance, and capable of producing movement without the influence of peripheral feedback. So even though Ian doesn't have peripheral feedback, that's okay. He can still select, load, and play these motor programs. Now, if his eyes are open or in a neurologically intact individual, we can transition from a motor program to adjusting that with closed loop control. And this second part is about feedback, but we'll see this in action when we get to some experiments. So whenever we initiate a movement, that movement is carried out essentially in an open loop manner until enough time has passed to allow feedback to operate. There's two caveats here. So you have to be making a long enough movement that there's time for closed loop control to kick in. That's typically thought to be 100 milliseconds. We'll see that later. And feedback has to be available. So if I do a super slow movement, but I close my eyes and let's say all of a sudden I'm deafferented, then I'm not going to be able to transition to closed loop control. But if I can see my hand, feel my hand, and I do a movement that's longer than 100 milliseconds, then there'll be this transition from the movement be initiated being with open loop control and then closed loop control kicking in if and as needed after 100 milliseconds. Here's an analogy for it. So imagine, all the movements that you know how to make. Think of this as like a stack of Blu-rays in your mind. And let's say you decide, oh, I want to throw a football. So you go to the stack, you find the football throwing motor program, you load it into your motor areas, shown here as putting it into the Blu-ray player. So we know the program, we've selected it, we've programmed it, it's ready to go. And then response initiation would be, well, you click the play button. I guess that's not the play button, is it? So you press the play button and it sends out that motor program. So hopefully this concept of motor program sounds convincing, but let's look at actual evidence for it. And the first we've kind of talked a bit about, but we'll look at an actual experiment, and that's deafferentation. This is GL. I'm actually can't remember what her real name is. I think it starts with, her first name starts with G, last name starts with L, but I can't remember what it is. And she, like Ian, is deafferented. I think it was also a virus that attacked her dorsal root ganglions, but I can't remember the exact story. I almost got to meet her. She came and did some experiments at the university where I went to grad school, but she was there the summer before I started. And interestingly enough, after she had this virus that attacked her nervous system, she kind of changed careers, and now she travels the world to different labs and does experiments to learn about how we use proprioception, what life is like without proprioception. Probably not a super well-paying career, but they would pay for her travel, and there'd be a bit of money, what they often call an honorarium, for coming and helping with science. So here she is, and this is an empty cup, to be safe. But they have her, they ask her to hold it, and she can't feel it. So what she does is she uses vision. So she's going to rely on vision to see where that cup is, and to grasp it. Because she doesn't have proprioception, she probably uses more force than necessary. We're really good with proprioception at unconsciously detecting these like micro slips, and our hands automatically adjust without us even thinking about it. GL can't do that without proprioception, so for a larger margin of safety, she'll grip harder than we would on average. So if she's looking at it, she can do it. She can keep the cup there, and if it moves, she sees it move and she can move it back. Now, if we ask her to close her eyes, now she can't feel the cup, she can't see the cup, and what will happen is the cup will just start swerving, and that's obviously why the cup is empty here. So you can see she doesn't even realize that the cup is not where it is anymore, and eventually it'll swerve far enough that she might lose it or even drop it. So this is GL. So very similar case to Ian Waterman. This specific experiment here, I believe, was with GL. This is what it looked like. So they're going to test GL, and they're also going to test age-matched controls, but those individuals are neurologically intact. So everyone will start by putting their hand at a home position. There's 3 targets in front of them that they can see. The lights will go out, so now vision is gone. Even with their eyes open, vision's not helping. One of those targets will illuminate, so they can see that, and their goal is to move through the target. So a lot of experiments, you move to the target. In this one, you're told to just move through that target. The lights would turn back on after your movement. You'd return to the home position. The lights would turn back out, and then randomly a different target would appear, and you're instructed to move through that target. So neurologically intact individuals, they're doing this with mostly proprioception. So okay, I see the target, I feel my hand here, I remember my hand being here, and now I'm going to move it there. So they can do some closed loop control with proprioception. GL won't be able to do any closed loop control. She's got no vision, no proprioception. So here's control participants. This is one participant. And you can see that they are able to move in different directions depending on which target appears. Now they're not super accurate, so they've missed here. And that's because we're not really good with just proprioception. Proprioception is not as accurate a sense as vision. So this is actually good, normal performance. What happens with GL? So it looks a lot worse. The good news is she can still move. So just like I said with Ian Wire, when he closes his eyes, he can still make movements with open loop control. GL is doing the same. And we do see that these movements are more to the left, these ones are more to the middle, and these ones are more to the right. So she has programmed a movement, she has executed it and moved. The reason she's less accurate is because she can't rely on closed loop control and proprioception like a control participant. But even when we're deafferented with our eyes closed, we can still make movements via open loop control, purely relying on those motor programs. All right, that is our first example. Let's look at our second source of evidence for motor programs. We get to try this one for ourselves. It's an experiment, and I guess the fancy terminology for it is inhibiting an anticipatory action. So let's look at that. Okay, so we'll try the task, and then we'll look at the results and talk about how it tells us about motor programs. What's going to happen here is this is a clock that's going to tick down. So it will start from here, and it's going to tick around like so. Now notice this circle over here. This is the goal. And the task here is that when the target, when the clock makes it to the target, you want to clap. So synchronous with it reaching the target. This is an anticipatory action. So this is ticking down. And what happens here is the brain, to be efficient, says, okay, I need to clap soon, so I'm going to prepare my clapping motor program. Now, at some point, we're going to have to initiate that motor program. And you might think, well, once it gets here, I'll initiate my clap. But if you do that, you'll clap a little too late. Because if you start your clap here, it takes some physical time for the hands to come together, and your clap may end up being a little too late. So, almost unconsciously, without thinking about it, as it gets closer and closer, our mind will realize, okay, I need to initiate the clap maybe here so that it physically occurs at the same time as the clock getting to the goal. So that's why it's an anticipatory action. Okay, one other thing. To make this a little more difficult or interesting, every once in a while the clock will stop. If the clock does not make it to the target, so let's say it stops here, then do not clap. All right? So I'll start a few trials here. We'll see the clock tick down, and if it makes it to the goal, clap synchronously with it arriving at the circle. Okay, here we go. Not sure if I should try it because I know the trick behind this, so it's maybe best if I don't. But please try it yourselves. Here we are. Okay, so hopefully you clapped synchronously with the clock reaching the goal. Let's do some more. Okay, this is just to help you get your timing down. But remember, sometimes it will stop. But not on that one. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the clock stopped a long way away, and hopefully you were able to not clap. Ooh, okay, getting closer. Okay, hopefully you clapped. All right. Now when I do this in the classroom, on this one, what we often see is half the students clap and half the students don't clap. And for those who clap, I always ask, did you see the clock stop before the goal? And they all say, yes, I saw it stop, but there wasn't enough time to invoke closed loop control. Remember, closed loop control takes time. And this is a very, clap clapping is a very fast action. So you might see it stop, but the problem is if you've already initiated that clapping action, you might say, oh, it stopped. What do I need to do? I should not clap. How do I do that? Pull my arms apart. Okay, send out that motor program, that correction. But by the time it gets to the hands, it's too late. You've already clapped. So let's look at the kind of average results in this experiment. So here we have the time before the response on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the probability of inhibition, which is maybe the opposite way of thinking about this. But 1, that's 100%. That means you did inhibit your action, which means you stopped, so you did not clap. And 0 means you did not inhibit, or in other words, you did clap, so you did not stop. So a little odd on our y-axis. But just know that if it's 0, that means 100% of the time you clapped. If it's 1, 100% of the time you did not clap. Here's the time before the response. This is how close did the clock make it to the goal before stopping. I'm not exactly sure of the timing here, but 250, this would be the clock stops a long way away from the goal. And in that case, everyone should be able to not clap. So the data should be up here. And over on this end, this graph doesn't actually go to 0, but let's pretend it does. That would mean the clock makes it to the goal, and in that case, everyone should clap. So the data should be down here. So we know it's going to start here and end here, but the question is, what does it look like in the middle? And these are results for a set of participants for a clock that ticked down at a certain speed. I'm not sure if it was the same as the one in our slides. And what you can see is that the closer and closer the clock gets to getting to the goal, the more likely that you clapped. So there's a lot of data points here, and we tend to pick out one data point from this graph. It's called the point of no return. And to find this, what you do is you look at 50% probability, and that means on this given trial, 50% of the participants clapped and 50% did not clap. Or even, on 50% of the trials across all participants, they clapped or did not clap. So we look for 50%, which is 0.5 here. We go over to where it intersects our data, and then we go down to the x-axis. So the point of no return in this experiment is 140 milliseconds. Now, what is the point of no return? The point of no return is the statistical point where you have consciously released your motor program. And remember, in this experiment, that motor program, clapping, is a very fast movement. And once we've initiated it, it's so fast that there's no time for closed loop control. So in this experiment, based on the clock speed, it looks like participants said, okay, hands, go ahead and clap 140 milliseconds before the clock got to the goal, and that was enough time to clap synchronously with the goal. Let's review that. So in this clock experiment, you're anticipating the clock ticking down, so you select a motor program and you're just waiting to initiate it. The point of no return is statistically when you consciously release the motor program. Now after that, your body is automatically going to execute the motor programs. Think of those commands, those preset motor commands are being sent. Nothing you can do about it. They're going to start to play. It is possible to stop or alter a motor program after its initiation, but remember that requires slow closed loop control. And in this clapping action, very fast movement, sometimes we call it a ballistic movement, there's no time to invoke closed loop control. And that's why even when you see the clock stop, you still end up clapping, because by the time you realize it stopped, you prepare a correction, you start to send it to your hands, the clap's already over. Okay, 2 more examples. The last 2 both involve what we call triphasic EMG. So we'll start by first talking about what that is, and that will help us for the last 2 experiments. So ballistic movements, fast movements, they exhibit a characteristic pattern of muscle activations between the agonist and the antagonist. And this could be any type of ballistic movement. Remember, science likes to be very reductive and make things simple. So the example we're going to see is elbow extension. Not a very interesting movement, but if you think about, okay, if my hand starts here and I have a goal out here, how do I get my hand to do that? Well, the agonist is going to be the tricep. That's going to get my arm moving out. And the muscle that opposes that movement, the antagonist, is my bicep. We could do this, at the finger. We could do a fast movement at the finger. It could be, well, can't see my legs, but imagine, flexing or extending your knee. They would all show this triphasic muscle activity. And this is, although you might not do that sort of specific movement in a daily task, imagine jumping. Well, what now you're probably combining are these triphasic EMG motor programs at several joints. So they are kind of like a foundational movement pattern, almost like a 2x4 Lego block. You might not build anything with just one 2x4, but you start adding them together and you can make these more complex structures. You can make more complex movements like jumping. All right, so back to the triphasic EMG pattern. So it's 3 bursts of muscle activity. So EMG is, of course, electromyography, electric signals from the muscles. We've got 3 bursts, so that's triphasic. And we're going to stick with elbow extension. Both these experiments use elbow extension. And here this is just showing a participant, and we've attached electrodes to their tricep and to their bicep. One reason you might pick the arm over, say, the finger is the muscles for the fingers are very small, so they're hard to record. It's very easy to find the bicep and tricep. It's also typically fairly comfortable for the participant, so we ask them to roll up their sleeve. If you want to do hip extension, well, then we got to put electrodes on your butt, and that's maybe not as much fun for everyone. So using the bicep and tricep is a very simple way to do this experiment. So our agonist, that's our tricep. That's if I move my arm slowly out, that's probably mostly my tricep. The antagonist, the muscle that could resist that movement, is the bicep. There are other muscles, of course, that extend and flex the elbow, but we'll kind of keep it simple with the prime movers. Here's an example of a trial. So the participant, they get a go signal. They start at a certain position. There's a target, and they're making a fast movement. It's not a slow movement. We won't see a triphasic pattern there. It's going to be these fast, ballistic movements out to the target. So here's the position of the arm at the start and at the end, or I guess that would be the position of the elbow. And over top of this, we'll overlay the muscle activity. So this is the agonist. This is the tricep activity. And the way we label this is we see this initial burst. We call this the first agonist, or AG1. There's then this kind of quiet period where there's no activity in the agonist, and then followed by a second burst that's usually not as big but stays on for longer, and we call this the second agonist. So that's our agonist. Now the antagonist is also involved in this movement, and here we've plotted it negative just to differentiate it from the agonist. Although the electrical activity from muscles, if this is 0, and your bicep would be positive and negative, but here we've just flipped it all negative. And the tricep would also be positive and negative, but here we've flipped it all positive, just to make it clear when each is active. What we see in the antagonist is a single burst that comes on later and stays on. So we call this the antagonist burst. So that's our triphasic EMG. We've got the first agonist, followed by the antagonist, followed by the second agonist. The question is, or the more interesting part is, what are these 3 bursts doing? How do they allow us to move to that target? Okay, let's look at the 3 bursts. So the first agonist burst, what it is, it's the main impulse for the movement. So think about a cannon launching a cannonball. You've got the gunpowder in there, you light it, boom, there's that explosion, the cannonball goes flying. That's the main impulse to get the cannonball going. That's the same sort of role as the first agonist. We need, to produce force to get the arm starting to go to the target. And that's the first agonist. What we can see, we'll go back here for a second, is that the first agonist activity begins, right around here, and there's quite some time before the arm actually starts to move. So AG1 precedes movement onset. The reason is that your arm has inertia. It's heavy, and we start to produce force, but the arm's not going to move instantaneously. It's going to take a little time to overcome inertia and get your arm moving. That will depend on the body part you're moving. So the leg, typically heavier than the arm, it's going to take longer to overcome inertia. The eye, lighter than the arm, so there's going to be less time to overcome inertia. All right, so the first agonist gets our arm going. Now, we don't want to just go until our arm stops. We're trying to stop at a target. So we need to start slowing the arm down. And that is, of course, done by the antagonist. So, the tricep has gotten us going. More tricep is not going to help us stop. Instead, we're going to turn on our antagonist. So we put the brakes on. Now, because this is such a fast movement, we can't just kind of come to a slow stop, right? We need to stop right on the target. And the way our body does this is it reactivates the agonist with the second agonist burst. So if you see here, see how the antagonist and the agonist are on for a lot of the time? Well, we're co-contracting both of those muscles to stop, on a dime as quickly as possible. So if I launch with my tricep, I start to slow down, and now to really clamp down on that target, if I activate both muscles, well, my arm is going to freeze in place, right? So the second agonist turns on to produce co-contraction with the antagonist and stop the arm, hopefully right where we want. Now, the idea is that the triphasic motor program is a very fundamental motor program, maybe not as interesting as throwing a football, but we can use this for many ballistic actions, different joints, and we can combine several of these together to do something, say, like jumping. That's the triphasic motor program. Now let's apply it to experiments to learn more about motor programs. So here's the first experiment. It's very straightforward. Participants are seated. They're at a manipulanda. There's a home position. They're going to move to a target, make a fast ballistic movement to the target, something just like this. They get a go tone, they move. Come back, go tone, move. Every once in a while, what will happen when they try to move is the manipulanda will be locked. And here it's called movement blocking, but you can think of the movement being locked. So how this works is there's a pin that quietly, without the participant realizing, comes up into the manipulanda so that when they try to move, their arm will not move. The question is, on these unexpected block trials, what's going to happen to the triphasic EMG pattern? We can think of this as a continuum, so maybe there will be no EMG. Well, I don't think that's going to happen because participants don't know that they're blocked, so they're going to try to move. So there should be some EMG. Will we see a full triphasic EMG pattern? So even though they're blocked, will they send out that whole motor program? I don't think that's going to happen either because they are going to realize they're blocked. Closed loop control can kick in after a little while. So I think we're going to, well, I know we're going to see something in the middle. Okay, here's some data from the experiment. Now this is a controlled trial. So normal trial, they get the tone, they move to the target, and we see the triphasic EMG. The EMG here is being processed one step further than before. So we have the agonist as all positive, the antagonist as all negative, but instead of the normal, fluctuations that we see. This data has been low pass filtered. It's called a linear envelope. That's just kind of what they call it in the EMG world. Instead of seeing those up and down, the linear envelope kind of traces around the outside of those fluctuations. So it's yet another way to look at EMG data. Regardless, here we see the first agonist, we've got the antagonist, and we've got the second agonist. So just normal triphasic EMG motor program. Let's look at what happens when participants are blocked. So these are the dotted trials. And if we look, it's very similar, and they found it not significantly different. Visible difference here, but not significantly so, to here. Then there starts to be changes, right? Then these two curves are different. If we look at the antagonist, yep, comparable, 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 until here. Notice where we are, 0.1 second, that's 100 milliseconds, and then things start to be different. So the conclusion here is when you move normally and when you're blocked, the EMG is identical for the first 100 milliseconds. So it's identical, from here to here. Same EMG, not statistically different. Now, after 100 milliseconds, there are significant differences. So, this EMG is not the same as this EMG. Same thing down here. This is a little different than this. Now, what's happening? Well, what we're seeing is the transition from open loop control to closed loop control. So remember that even with feedback, we begin all movements essentially in open loop control because there hasn't been time yet to transition to closed loop control. So in the normal situation, you prepare that ballistic movement and you send it out. In the block condition, you don't know you're blocked, you prepare a triphasic ballistic program and you send it out. So in both cases, they begin identically because they're both in open loop control. In the normal condition, you say, oh yeah, my arm's going, and you just finish executing that program. But when you're blocked, you start to move, and proprioception says, hey, I'm not moving. Vision says, hey, I'm not moving. So your body says, well, I can use closed loop control to stop trying to do this triphasic motor program. It's not helpful. I'm blocked. If we were robots, what we would see is that the EMG, once closed loop control kicks in, would immediately drop to 0, and there'd be no more muscle activity. We don't see that. There is evidence that we've reduced the antagonist, so we are managed to say, hey, I'm blocked, let's turn down the antagonist. And the agonist also gets smaller, so notice, in this area, the agonist is a lot smaller. But we're not quite like robots. We can't instantaneously stop that entire triphasic motor program. But we do realize we're blocked, and then after 100 milliseconds, we're able to invoke closed loop control and say, hey, let's stop trying to execute this motor program. Let's summarize that. So in both conditions, the motor program, that ballistic movement, was initiated under open loop control. You're not using feedback. It's open loop control, so the first 100 milliseconds are going to be identical in normal and blocked trials. Once there's enough time to process sensory feedback to use closed loop control, and this is one of the experiments that shows the minimum for that is 100 milliseconds, at that point we can use closed loop control in the block condition to say, hey, stop trying to make this triphasic motor program work because we're blocked. So this experiment really gets to the second part, the kind of note on the definition. Remember, we said that the movement is carried out essentially open loop until enough time has passed to allow feedback processes to operate. And we now know that enough time is typically 100 milliseconds. And that's right where we saw the transition from open loop to closed loop control in this task. One last example, and the good news is it also relies on triphasic EMG, which we already know about. It also relies on the Startle-React Effect. So let's talk about what that is first. So it is part of the startle response. So what's the startle response? Well, you're probably familiar with that. You know, if you've ever had a friend sneak up and jump out and yell boo, you get startled, right? It's a reflexive response. Here, this is a picture of someone getting a really good startle in, and this reflex does modulate. You can have a small startle, or you can have a big startle. We all probably have a friend that's easier to startle than others, and we'll actually talk about that too. Anyways, when you're startled, if you have a really big response, what we see is that the chin tucks, and to do that, that's our sternocleidomastoid muscles contract. You often blink. That's our orbicularis oculi contracts to blink. The arms flex and the legs extend. Now, why do we do this? Well, we don't know exactly why. These reflexive behaviors have likely evolved over millions, thousands of years, or maybe not millions, over many years. And the idea, the hypothesis is that maybe it's a protective response. We can't really test it unless we could go back in time and test humans and maybe prior species. But it seems it makes sense that it could be a protective response. So imagine early humans out hunting, gathering, and a wild animal jumps out. Well, maybe it's good to protect yourself. Protect your squishy bits. So get your arms in front of yourself, tuck your chin to protect your neck. So the startle response may be a protective reflex. This is a video of an individual with a neurological condition that essentially makes them extremely sensitive to startle. And I have some of the clinical information here. So they have an exaggerated startle response. Their threshold for startle is extremely low. So to get me to startle, you might really have to yell boo loudly. This individual doesn't take much to get them to startle, and their startle response is much larger than average. The condition is called Hyperekplexia, and it occurs from a genetic mutation that affects the neurotransmitter glycerin, which is an inhibitor in the central nervous system. So if you don't have enough of it, parts of your nervous system that control the startle reflex can be overactive. So take a look at this video of an individual being tested with hyperekplexia. All right, so we saw there what the startle response looks like. The more interesting part that we're going to focus on now is what happens when you're prepared to make a movement and you get startled. And that we tested in the lab. So we're back to the same old experiment with the elbow extension. We expect a nice triphasic EMG motor program, but the difference in this experiment is that go tone. So note we have this big speaker right behind the participant. On most trials, it's going to be a happy go tone, about 80 decibels, maybe something like beep, and you move. Every once in a while, it's going to be 120 decibels, very loud, very short, so as to not damage anyone's hearing. But that loud tone, even though the participant knows that this will happen on some trials, will likely startle them. And we're going to see what happens to their movement. So just like the previous experiment, you're making these 60-degree elbow extension movements as quickly and accurately as possible. So there would be a target that's 60 degrees away that you're moving to. There's 45 total trials, so not a very long experiment. And 6 of those, randomly on 6 of those trials, we're going to replace the happy-go tone with the startling tone. And the question is, what is going to happen to the triphasic motor program when you're startled? Let's look at a control trial. So here, 0, this is when the go tone is played. And then about 130 milliseconds later, the participant starts to move out to 60-degree target. Now notice that it kind of goes above and below. This oscillation around the target is very common. So when I move to a target, it might look like my hand stops on a dime, but if we looked at it in slow-mo, we'd see some oscillations as it comes to a stop. And these are bigger and smaller on different trials, so don't worry about what's happening there. Just know that that's normal. Down here we see muscle activity, and this is maybe the best way to look at muscle activity. So this is raw muscle activity. It's both positive and negative, so we haven't made the tricep all positive, the bicep all negative. And these are the actual fluctuations. We're not looking at, say, the linear envelope. But what we can see in the tricep is the first agonist. So there's AG1. You can see it precedes movement onset. There's that quiet period. And then we have the second agonist. Oh, there's our antagonist. Second agonist over here. If we look at the bicep, that's our antagonist. And it turns on and then stays on to co-contract with the second agonist. All right, down here we have the sternocleidomastoid, so the neck muscles, and the question is, did the participant get startled? And from the sternocleidomastoid and the orbicularis oculi, we can conclude no. This is a control trial, so we're not expecting them to be startled, but just in case, were they startled on this trial? And we're going to say no, because when you're startled, remember, you tuck your chin, you blink your eyes, and that should occur at a reflexive latency less than 100 milliseconds. So note that there's basically no muscle activity there, so they're not tucking their chin or blinking their eyes at a reflexive latency. There is neck muscle activity later on. And the reason we see this is when you make a really fast movement with your arm, you need to stabilize your body. So well, I don't even think I can not stabilize my body as I did that. But if somehow you didn't contract your neck muscle at all, well then your neck might flop around as you move your arm fast. So this muscle activity is kind of a postural response that says, okay, I'm going to do this with my arm, so I need to stabilize my neck. And we could probably also see other stabilizing muscles, say, in the back. So there is neck muscle activity, but it's not at a startle latency. So this is a postural response and not a startle reflex. Okay. That's a control trial. One last thing for it here. Instead of measuring reaction time, which is when the movement begins, because we have EMG data, we can actually measure premotor reaction time, which is when muscle activity begins. And this is going to be shorter, remember, because the agonist begins before movement onset. And here what they found in this experiment, that the premotor reaction time, on average was 95 milliseconds. And that's going to be important when we look at startle trials. Here's a startle trial. We still see the participant move to the 60-degree target. The oscillations are a little bigger here, but that's not important. That even control trials can be this big, so that's not caused by the startle. We see the first agonist. We see, let's see, antagonist? Yep, there we go. We've got the antagonist, and then we have the second agonist. And when they statistically analyzed these, they found that the duration, the magnitudes, they were all comparable to control trials. Was the participant startled here? Yes. So now we can see neck muscle activity occurring at startle reflex latency. So they are tucking their chin. This does kind of blend into the subsequent postural response. How about their eyes? Did they blink? Yes. And we see them blinking at a reflexive latency, before 100 milliseconds. So this is good evidence that on this trial they were startled. So at first it kind of looks like nothing changes except, they are startled, but there's one very important difference. And that is when we measure premotor reaction time, so when does muscle activity begin, here, and on average, it was about 64 milliseconds. And remember, on control trials, it was 90 something, 95. Too bad it wasn't 94. Anyways, so what's happening on these startle trials is that same motor program is coming out, but a lot sooner. And this is another one of those experiments where we learned a lot from what participants told us. So they said they could tell that they were executing that motor program faster, and they also said that I didn't consciously initiate it. I didn't tell my arm to move, I just got startled and it automatically came out. Now, one neat thing about this 64 milliseconds is this is too fast for conscious control. If we measure the minimum amount of time to hear something, and then for your brain to say, okay, I heard it, initiate my movement, and send it out, it's not long. That's not a lot of processes need to occur there, but it's longer than 64 milliseconds. It's probably about 95 milliseconds. And here you are consciously initiating your motor program. So you hear the tone, beep, oh, I should move my arm, move it. Of course, all at a very fast rate. On startle trials, 64 milliseconds is way too fast for conscious initiation. And from this and more studies, the hypothesis is that when you're startled, not only do you have that characteristic startle reflex, but for whatever reason, any prepared program within your motor apparatus is automatically executed. So you're not consciously initiating it, it's automatically sent out. And that automatic initiation is a lot faster, so premotor reaction time is a lot quicker. Now, why do we do that? Why, when we're startled, it makes sense that we protect ourselves, but why are we automatically initiating a motor program? And there's two ideas here. One is that, well, maybe when you're startled, the best movement to execute is the one you were preparing. So if you're out there, hunting a tiger, ready to throw a spear, and then it surprises you, well, maybe you want to go through and throw that spear. Alternatively, well, maybe when you're startled, we've evolved to react as quickly as possible. And we've got a motor program we need to get rid of before we can do a new motor program. And maybe the quickest way to get rid of it is just to send it out to the muscles. Maybe that's faster than saying, okay, no, I don't want to do it, get rid of it, and program something new. Let's summarize what's happening here, because there's quite a bit. So the Startle-React Effect is when a loud, startling tone releases whatever movement is prepared before the imperative stimulus, so the motor program, with a much reduced reaction time. So in this case, normal control trial, beep, 95 milliseconds later, you move. But if that beep is a loud startle tone and you get startled, we see that you unconsciously or involuntarily release that motor program with a much reduced latency. You initiate it automatic, and automatic is faster than voluntary initiation, and premotor reaction time drops potentially all the way down to 65 milliseconds, something that's too short for conscious initiation. So if we go back and think of, okay, I'm going to prepare this movement. I pick out my triphasic motor program from my long-term procedural memory. I've got it ready. I load it into my motor apparatus, and normally when we want to make the movement, we then press play. So that's response initiation, conscious process, and it's relatively slow. When we're startled, what happens is our brain automatically presses play for us. So that automatic pressing of play, you can actually feel it as a participant in these experiments. It's kind of fun. It's a little annoying to be startled repeatedly, but it's interesting to feel that movement come out even without conscious initiation. And it's quite apparent in these studies. That does bring up an interesting ethical question. Can you be liable for a movement that you make unconsciously or involuntarily? So think about firearm safety. And one of the universal rules of firearm safety is to keep your finger off the trigger. And one reason for that is, so imagine a police officer going into an emergency situation with gun drawn, and if the gun's drawn, maybe they see a threat up ahead, and they might be thinking, okay, I might need to shoot, I might need to shoot. That might be enough to prepare the trigger pull motor program. And it makes sense to do that so that you can be as quick as possible if and when you need to pull the trigger. But if you're startled, so if your partner comes up behind you, taps you on the shoulder to say, hey, I got your back, and you're not expecting that, that tactile, unexpected tactile information could startle you, just like the unexpected loud tones in the experiment. So if you prepared that motor program, your finger's on the trigger, you get startled, you will automatically pull that trigger. And let's say, you at that moment you weren't pointing at the criminal, you're pointing at an innocent bystander, you shoot them, are you liable for that? So yes, you made the movement, but you did so involuntarily via the startle reflex. So it's getting into some very interesting, ethical debates, outside of the topic of this course, but something interesting to think about. Are we responsible for our involuntary movements? But yes, best, keep your finger off the trigger. That is our fourth source of evidence for motor programs. So we talked about deafferentation. So if you're deafferented, you close your eyes, you can still move. You're using your motor programs in a completely open loop manner. We looked at inhibiting anticipatory actions, and that showed us that once we start the motor program, we can't stop it right away. It takes time for closed loop control. With movement blocking, we saw very nicely that transition from open loop to closed loop control at around 100 milliseconds. And then with the Startle-React Effect, we saw that we can actually involuntarily trigger those motor programs. And although it's an interesting experiment, it's kind of fun / frustrating for participants. It's not that much fun to be startled, but it's neat to feel your motor program be automatically initiated. Motor control researchers now use the Startle-React Effect as a way to examine your motor program without consciousness involved. Kind of a more pure way to see your motor program without closed loop control kicking in. That's the end of our motor programs module. Good luck with the test, and I'll see you in the next one.